If you line up the world's religions and you start comparing doctrine, then you get chaos. You get fighting, you get disagreement, you get centuries of conflict. You get people fighting wars over whose God is the real one, over whose scriptures are true and whose rituals are correct. But if you stop looking at the rules and instead you look at the mystics within each of these religions, you'll find something extraordinary. You'll find that they end up saying the same thing. A Jewish Kabbalist, a Sufi poet, a Christian monk, a Hindu sage, all of them from different backgrounds and different cultures, describing the same experience, sometimes using almost identical words. That is not a coincidence, and today I'm going to show you what is happening. In every major religion, you have a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you have doctrine. That is rules and rituals and institutional authority. You have people telling you what to believe and how to behave and what's going to happen to you if you don't behave. At the other end of the spectrum, you have mysticism. That is a direct, personal experience of the divine. Instead of just having a belief about God, you have union with God. Now, the doctrinal end of the spectrum is where most of the conflict lives, because when you are very attached to a specific set of laws or to a particular interpretation of a text, then disagreement happens when you come across somebody who has a different interpretation of the text or who is following a different set of laws. Christians and Muslims, Sunni and Shia, Orthodox and Reform, Protestant and Catholic, the disagreements are very real, and the history is long and often bloody. In Judaism, there is Kabbalah, the mystical tradition that looks beneath the literal text of the Torah. They look towards a hidden inner reality. They speak of Ein Sof, the infinite, the ultimate ground of reality from which all existence arises. There isn't a personal God sitting up there in the clouds looking down on everyone. There is an infinite presence that underlies and permeates everything. In Islam, there is Sufism. The Sufis are probably the most beloved mystical poets in history. I'm sure you've heard of Rumi, who is one of the most famous Sufi poets. He endlessly wrote about the dissolution of the self into the divine. He said, "I searched for God and I found only myself. I searched for myself and I found only God." Al-Hallaj was another Sufi mystic. He became so immersed in his experience that he declared Ana Haq, which means I am the truth. This was not accepted in his time and he was killed for blasphemy. Although he wasn't claiming to be God, he was claiming that the boundary between himself and God had disappeared. In Christianity, there is Christian mysticism. For example, Meister Eckhart, a 14th century Dominican friar, said, "The eye with which I see God is the eye with which God sees me." And Teresa of Avila described a union with God so complete that the sense of a separate self disappears. And in Hinduism, particularly in Advaita Vedanta, they articulate this probably the most clearly when it says, Atman is Brahman. The self is identical with ultimate reality. The same movement every time, inward, past the ego, towards something that has no boundary, no beginning and no end. Now, every religion that I've mentioned so far, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, it could be said, and people have said it in comments of my previous videos, that these are all cultures that could be influenced by each other. You know, they all span a vast distance, but across the same landmass, and there have been trade routes and ways that they could have communicated and passed on teachings and ideas across time. But then you look at the Aboriginal Australians, who were completely isolated and separate from these cultures. They, too, land at a similar conclusion. At the heart of Aboriginal spirituality is the idea of dreaming, and not dreaming that you do at night time when you're asleep, but a fundamental underlying reality from which everything arises and to which everything will return. A ground of being that is prior to the self, prior to the individual, prior to time. That is Brahman. It is Ein Sof. It is the Tao. And then there are the Amazonian traditions, whose ceremonies go back thousands of years. A few years ago, I sat in some of those ceremonies, and what I experienced there, the dissolution of the sense of self, the connection with all of reality, that is the same thing that is described by these Christian monks and these Hindu sages. One thing that I keep thinking about is that a lot of these mystics were persecuted and even killed, as I mentioned earlier about Al-Hallaj, but also Meister Eckhart and many of the Kabbalists were persecuted in their time. Why would the religious institutions punish and destroy these people who went furthest into their beliefs? I think it's because doctrine moves faster and further than experience. So the original mystics had this experience of the divine, and then they tried their best to put that experience into words, which really isn't even possible. And then people heard those words, and they turned those words into beliefs, and they codified them into rules and rituals. And then institutions built up around them to protect those rules and rituals. The institutions became more concerned with fighting for their own survival rather than pointing back to that original experience. This is when the map becomes more important than the actual territory itself, and the finger pointing at the moon becomes more important than the moon. Jesus himself seemed to be very aware of this danger, and he reserved some of his harshest words for the religious authorities within his own tradition. He called the Pharisees and the Sadducees vipers and snakes and hypocrites. He was speaking out against those who turned living wisdom into rigid rule-following. He called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, empty on the inside. Now you might think that the most obvious answer is to get rid of doctrine altogether. But interestingly, the mystics didn't abandon their traditions. Meister Eckhart was a committed Christian friar. Rumi was a devout Muslim. The Kabbalists were deeply observant Jews, and Ramana Maharshi lived his entire life within a very Hindu setting. Rumi said the lamps are different, but the light is the same. But it doesn't mean you have to abandon the lamp. It just means you shouldn't mistake it for the light. Which brings us to the really important question. If all of these traditions are all pointing towards the same thing, what exactly is that thing? What are they all pointing at? Across all of these traditions, when you strip away the language and the imagery, a few things consistently remain. First, the boundary between the self and the divine disappears. Second, what remains is described in contradictory terms, and somehow both seem true. For example, in Kabbalah, you have Ein Sof, infinity, and you have Ayin, nothing. And in Buddhism, you have Buddhist mystics who talk of an emptiness that is somehow full and luminous. Christian contemplatives talk of a darkness that is somehow the most alive thing that can possibly be named. Third, there is love. And I don't mean love as an everyday emotion that comes and goes, but love as the texture of reality itself. In the Bible, John wrote simply, God is love. Rumi talked about love being the force that moves the sun and the stars. Ramana Maharshi talked of the self as the ultimate reality, and he also said that that self is love. And fourth, something that William James noticed when he studied mystical experiences. He said that it had a noetic quality, meaning that it wasn't just a pleasant feeling, it was something that felt like the truth. It felt like knowledge. It felt like something that was really always there the whole time. We tend to think of mysticism as being strange or unusual, as living on the fringe of religion. It's unusual people with unusual beliefs about the world and about God. But what if we've got it wrong? What if it's the opposite? What if the mystics aren't the outliers, but they're the ones who have arrived at where the traditions have all been pointing to all along? And that path inward, through stillness and silence, and through whatever practice it is that helps you to loosen the grip on the ego, that is not reserved for sages and monks. It is available to anybody. It's available in every moment, including this one. If you want to explore this idea further, then watch this video next.